Imagine waking up tomorrow and every building is gone. Every road, every city, every farm, every fence, just vanished. You're standing on Earth, but it's not the Earth you know. There are no borders, no nations, no property lines, no grocery stores, no hospitals, no houses, just endless wilderness stretching in every direction, hills covered in forest, valleys thick with grass, rivers running wild with no bridges to cross them. This isn't some post-apocalyptic nightmare. This is just Tuesday. The year is 10,000 BCE. This is what life was actually like for your ancestors, not your great-great-grandparents, not even your ancestors from 1,000 years ago. We're talking about people who lived 12,000 years ago, before Egypt, before Mesopotamia, before anyone anywhere had built anything that would last. And here's the thing that'll mess with your head. These people had the exact same brains as you, same processing power, same emotional range, same capacity for love and fear and curiosity and creativity. But their entire existence was so radically different from ours that it's almost impossible to comprehend. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments, and it's like Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at bedtime, all at once. There's something weirdly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across this planet that our ancestors spent millennia figuring out how to survive. So, 10,000 BCE, the Ice Age is finally ending. For over 100,000 years, massive glaciers have covered huge chunks of the northern hemisphere. Ice sheets 2 miles thick, stretching from Canada down to what's now New York. Europe buried under ice from Scandinavia to Germany. But now, the planet is warming. The glaciers are retreating. Sea levels are rising as all the frozen water melts. Coastlines are shifting. New lands are appearing, climates are changing, and humans, all 5 to 10 million of them scattered across the globe, are about to go through the most profound transformation in our entire history. But they don't know that yet. In 10,000 BCE, humans are doing what they've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. Hunting, gathering, moving, surviving. There are no cities because nobody's figured out how to build them yet. More importantly, nobody needs them. There are no farms because nobody's domesticated plants or animals. No pottery because you can't carry ceramic pots when your entire life is movement. No writing because there's nothing that needs to be written down that can't be remembered and passed along through stories. You might be wondering, what did they eat? Where did they sleep? How did they stay warm, stay safe, stay alive without any of the things we think of as necessities? These are the questions that should keep you up at night, or in this case, help you fall asleep, because we're going to answer all of them. Here's what's fascinating. These people weren't primitive. That's the wrong word. They were sophisticated in ways we've completely forgotten. They could read landscapes like you read text messages. They could track animals across miles of wilderness by noticing a bent blade of grass. They could predict weather patterns, find water in deserts, identify hundreds of plant species, and know exactly which ones would heal you and which ones would kill you. They carried entire encyclopedias of survival knowledge in their heads, knowledge that took thousands of generations to accumulate, knowledge that most of us today couldn't replicate if our lives depended on it. The paradox is stunning. We have smartphones, they had stone tools, we have GPS, they had stars, we have supermarkets, they had whatever they could find. But ask yourself honestly, if you were dropped into their world tomorrow, who'd survive longer? You with your college degree and your apps, or them with their intimate understanding of every plant, animal and water source within 100 miles? Over the next few hours, we're going to walk through a world without walls. We're going to explore what daily life actually looked like when every single thing you needed to survive had to be found, made, or carried. We're going to understand how humans formed bonds and built communities without ever staying in one place for long. We're going to discover what they believed about the world, how they healed their sick, what they taught their children, and how they managed to not just survive but thrive for thousands of years with essentially nothing. This is the story of human life before civilization, before agriculture, before cities, before everything changed. This is 10,000 BCE, the world before walls, and it might be the most important story you've never heard. Before there were cities, before there were farms, before there were permanent homes of any kind, there was movement, constant, purposeful, seasonal movement that defined every aspect of human existence. This was life for our ancestors in 10,000 BCE, and it had been life for hundreds of thousands of years before that. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle wasn't just what people did, it was what people were, what evolution had shaped them to be. And understanding it means letting go of almost everything we think we know about work, family, and survival. First, forget the idea that these people were desperately struggling to survive, constantly hungry, always one disaster away from extinction. That's a myth we tell ourselves to feel better about modern life. The archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Hunter-gatherers in 10,000 BCE were actually remarkably successful. They were healthier than the first farmers who came after them. They were taller, had better teeth, suffered from fewer diseases, and most incredibly, they worked far less than we do today. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest their ancestors spent only about 3 to 5 hours per day on what we'd call subsistence activities: hunting, gathering, preparing food. The rest of their time was leisure, socializing, playing, creating art, telling stories. They had something most modern humans desperately lack: time abundance. But that abundance came from deep knowledge and constant movement. These weren't people wandering randomly hoping to stumble across food. They were experts in their environment, carrying mental maps that covered hundreds of square miles, tracking seasonal patterns that played out over years, sometimes decades. They knew where specific plants would fruit in different months. They understood animal migration routes so precisely they could predict where herds would be weeks in advance. This knowledge wasn't written down because writing didn't exist yet. It was carried in memory, reinforced through stories, and passed down generation to generation through careful teaching and constant practice. The nomadic rhythm dominated everything. Hunter-gatherer bands, typically 25 to 50 people, moved in seasonal circuits that could span enormous territories. In temperate regions, a single band might have a home range of 500 to 1,000 square miles, not because they needed all that space for resources, but because staying in one place for too long meant depleting local food sources and accumulating waste. So they moved. Every few weeks during productive seasons, more frequently during harsh months, less often when they found particularly resource-rich areas. These movements weren't random wandering. They followed carefully planned routes that had been refined over generations. Think of it as a calendar written across the landscape. In early spring, the band might move to coastal areas where shellfish were abundant and migratory birds were nesting. Late spring meant moving inland to where certain roots and tubers were ready for harvest. Summer brought them to river valleys, where salmon runs or similar fish migrations provided massive protein sources. Fall meant moving to areas where nut trees were dropping their harvest, where berries were ripening, where large game was fattening up for winter. Winter might mean returning to sheltered valleys where they'd cached food earlier in the year, where caves or rock overhangs provided protection from the elements. This seasonal circuit created a rhythm that structured everything else in their lives. They didn't have calendars in the way we understand them, but they had something more sophisticated. They read the environment constantly. The angle of sunlight told them what season was approaching. The behavior of animals signaled when migrations were beginning. The blooming of specific plants indicated when other food sources would be available. They lived inside the seasonal cycles in a way modern humans, insulated by technology and agriculture, can barely imagine. So what did a typical day actually look like for these people? Let's walk through it. Dawn. The camp begins, stirring as the sun rises. There's no alarm clock, but there doesn't need to be. Human bodies, without artificial light to disrupt their rhythms, naturally wake with daylight. The fire that was carefully banked the night before is being rebuilt. This is crucial. Fire provides warmth, light, protection from predators, and the means to cook food. Keeping fire alive was a constant responsibility. Not everyone knew how to create fire from scratch. That was specialized knowledge. But everyone knew how to maintain it, and letting the fire go out was considered serious negligence. As people wake, there's a morning ritual of checking the surroundings. Men might scout the immediate area for animal tracks or signs of danger. Women might check nearby water sources. Children are given small tasks: collecting firewood from the immediate vicinity, fetching water, helping to prepare the morning meal. But notice what's not happening. There's no rush. No one is frantically preparing for a long day of grueling labour. The morning meal might be simple: leftovers from the previous night's cooking, perhaps some gathered fruits or nuts, maybe fresh water from a nearby stream. The pace is relaxed. People talk, laugh, make plans for the day. By mid-morning, the actual work of survival begins. But even this term, work, is misleading. It was more like skilled activity that happened to provide sustenance. Hunting parties might form, usually men, though not exclusively. They might be tracking large game, deer, elk, wild boar, whatever was available in their region. But this wasn't the Hollywood version of hunting, where dozens of men chase a mammoth across the plains every day. That's dramatic, but inaccurate. Most hunting was actually small game: rabbits, birds, fish, things that could be caught reliably without enormous expenditure of energy or risk. When they did hunt larger animals, it was a masterclass in human intelligence and cooperation. These hunters weren't just tracking, they were predicting. They understood animal behavior so intimately, they could anticipate where prey would go before the animals themselves decided. They read tracks like we read books. This print shows a deer favouring its left hind leg, meaning it's injured, meaning it can't run as fast, meaning it's a better target. This broken branch means an animal passed through 3 hours ago. These droppings are fresh, less than an hour old. The animal is close. The weapons they used were sophisticated for their technology level. Spears, yes, but not just sharpened sticks. These were carefully crafted tools with stone points that had been worked for hours to achieve the right shape and sharpness. They were attached to wooden shafts with plant fibre bindings and natural adhesives made from tree resin. Some groups had already developed the atlatl, a spear thrower that used leverage to multiply throwing force. This simple device could launch a spear with enough power to take down animals much larger than humans. Other groups, particularly in some regions, had begun experimenting with bow and arrow technology, though it wasn't yet widespread in 10,000 BCE. That innovation was still spreading. But the real weapon wasn't the tool, it was coordination. When hunting large game, groups worked together with sophisticated tactics. Some hunters would position themselves downwind of the prey, while others created noise and a movement to drive the animal toward the waiting hunters. They used natural features of the landscape: cliff edges where animals could be stampeded, narrow valleys that funneled prey into kill zones, rivers and streams that forced animals to slow down. This required communication, planning, and the ability to think several steps ahead. It required trust that your partners would be where they said they'd be, doing what they said they'd do. And here's something crucial: they didn't hunt every day. When a large kill was made, it provided meat for the entire band for days, sometimes weeks if they could preserve it properly. This meant hunting was actually intermittent. Days or even weeks might pass between major hunts. This is part of why they had so much leisure time. You can't just hunt constantly. Game animals get spooked, populations need time to recover, and hunters need rest. Meanwhile, while hunting parties were out, gathering was happening. This was the backbone of the hunter-gatherer diet, not hunting. Gathered foods, mostly plant-based, provided 60 to 80% of calories in most environments, and gathering was where real expertise showed itself. The gatherers, often women though again not exclusively, had encyclopedic knowledge of local plants. They knew hundreds of species by sight. They could identify which ones were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They knew when each species was ready for harvest, where specific plants grew most abundantly, how to process foods that were toxic when raw, but nutritious when properly prepared. Gathering wasn't just picking berries, it was skilled foraging that required constant learning and sharp observation. Root vegetables had to be dug up, requiring tools and knowledge of where to look. Nuts had to be collected, often from high in trees, requiring climbing skills and timing to beat animals to the harvest. Seeds had to be gathered from grasses, requiring patience to collect enough to make the effort worthwhile. Some plant foods required extensive processing. Acorns, for instance, are incredibly nutritious but contain tannins that make them bitter and hard to digest. Hunter-gatherers developed techniques to leach out these tannins by crushing the acorns and soaking them repeatedly in water. This took time and knowledge that had to be passed down carefully from generation to generation. The gatherers also collected other crucial resources: medicinal plants, materials for tool making, fibers for creating cordage and baskets, clay for pottery in some regions, ochre and other, minerals for creating pigments. Gathering wasn't just about food. It was about collecting everything the band needed to survive and thrive. And like hunting, it didn't require constant, intense labour. Gatherers worked in the morning when it was cool, took breaks during the heat of midday, and might do another few hours in the afternoon. But they weren't grinding away dawn to dusk. There was always time for socialising, for teaching children, for simply resting. By midday, people were returning to camp with their takings. This is when food preparation began in earnest. Meat had to be butchered if a kill had been made. This was skilled work requiring knowledge of animal anatomy. Every part of the animal was used: meat for eating, bones for tools and weapons, sinew for binding and thread, hides for clothing and shelter, organs for specialized purposes. Nothing was wasted because waste meant carrying less of what you needed to the next camp. Cooking methods were more sophisticated than we often imagine. Yes, roasting over open flames was common, but hunter-gatherers had also developed techniques like pit cooking, digging a hole, lining it with hot stones, placing food inside wrapped in leaves, then covering it to create an underground oven that could slow cook for hours. They boiled water by heating stones in fires and dropping them into bark or hide containers filled with water and food. They smoked meat over low fires to preserve it. They sun-dried thin strips of meat and fish to create portable, long-lasting food supplies. Food preservation was actually critical to their lifestyle. You couldn't always predict when the next major food source would be available. So when abundance came, they preserved what they could. Smoking meat and fish was perhaps the most common preservation method. Building racks above slow-burning fires and letting smoke and heat slowly dry out the flesh created food that could last for months if stored properly. Drying plant foods was simpler. Spread berries or sliced roots in the sun, let them dehydrate, and they'd keep for extended periods. Some groups learned to create pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and dried berries that was incredibly nutrient-dense and could last for years. But preservation had limits. These people couldn't store massive quantities of food. They were mobile. Everything they owned had to be carried when they moved. So while they'd preserve what they could, they relied more on their knowledge of where food would be available and when. The landscape itself was their storage system. They knew where they'd cached nuts in a cool cave 3 months ago. They remembered where specific fruit trees were located throughout their territory. They anticipated seasonal abundances and moved to take advantage of them. Afternoons, after the main food acquisition and preparation work was done, were often surprisingly leisurely. This is when craft work happened. Making new tools, repairing old ones, creating clothing, working on shelters. But even this wasn't rushed. An experienced flint knapper could create a beautiful stone knife point in an hour or two, working with a relaxed focus that modern people, stressed and time-starved, struggle to comprehend. Children played, but their play was education. They mimicked hunting, practiced using small versions of adult tools, learned to identify plants by creating games around them. This is also when stories were told. Information was passed down not through written records but through narrative. Stories about the landscape, about where certain resources could be found, about what to do in specific situations, but also stories about ancestors, about spiritual beings, about the nature of the world. These narratives served multiple purposes. Entertainment, yes, but also education and cultural transmission. A story about an ancestor who got sick from eating a certain plant wasn't just entertainment. It was crucial survival information packaged in a memorable form. The band structure itself was crucial to making this lifestyle work. 25 to 50 people isn't random. It's the sweet spot for human social groups. Small enough that everyone knows everyone intimately. Large enough to provide genetic diversity and handle the various tasks of survival. The band was usually composed of several extended families, often related through complex kinship networks. You might have 3 or 4 nuclear families, plus some older relatives who no longer had young children, plus some younger adults not yet paired off. Leadership in these bands was remarkably egalitarian compared to what came later. There were no kings, no chiefs with absolute authority. Instead, leadership was situational and expertise-based. The best hunter might lead hunting expeditions. The most knowledgeable gatherer might decide where the band should move for certain seasonal harvests. The oldest members, who had seen the most seasonal cycles, might advise on long-term planning. But decisions affecting the whole group were generally made through consensus. Everyone had input. Everyone's survival depended on the group functioning smoothly, so everyone's voice mattered. Division of labour existed, but it was more flexible than we often assume. Yes, men typically hunted large game more than women. But this wasn't some rigid rule. It was practical. Hunting large animals required being away from camp for extended periods, sometimes days. Women who were pregnant or nursing young children couldn't easily do that. But postmenopausal women absolutely participated in hunts, and men absolutely participated in gathering, particularly when it involved climbing trees for nuts or hunting small game, which fell somewhere between hunting and gathering. Children had responsibilities too, scaled to their abilities. Young children, 3 to 5 years old, might collect firewood close to camp, fetch water from nearby sources, help with simple food, preparation. Older children, 7 to 12, would start learning specialized skills. Boys might go on hunting trips, not to hunt but to observe and learn. Girls might go on gathering expeditions, learning to identify plants and master the knowledge that would keep them alive. Teenagers were apprentice adults, capable of doing most tasks but still learning the subtle expertise that came only with years of experience. Age was respected in ways modern society often fails to achieve. Elderly members of the band weren't burdens. They were libraries of survival knowledge. Someone who had lived through 60 or 70 seasonal cycles had seen variations that younger people couldn't imagine. They'd experienced rare droughts, unusual animal behaviours, freak storms. They remembered when certain food sources failed and what alternatives worked. They were too valuable to abandon. When the ban moved, elderly members who couldn't walk well would be helped, sometimes carried, because their knowledge was literally life-saving. Evenings brought everyone back together. The main meal of the day was a communal affair. Food was shared, not hoarded. This wasn't altruism, it was practical. Today you make a kill and share with the band. Tomorrow someone else makes a kill and shares with you. This reciprocity was the insurance policy that kept everyone fed, even when individual luck varied. Refusing to share would get you ostracized, and ostracism from the band was essentially a death sentence. No one survived alone for long. After eating, as darkness fell and people gathered around fires, this was prime social time. More stories, more songs, more bonding. The firelight created intimacy, faces visible but softened, voices carrying clearly in the dark. This was when disputes got resolved, when relationships deepened, when culture got transmitted. The fire was the centre of human social life, and had been for hundreds of thousands of years. It's no coincidence that even today, people gather around fires when they want to feel connected. That's evolution speaking. Sleep came naturally as the fire died down to embers. There were no electric lights to disrupt natural circadian rhythms, no artificial stimulation to keep brains buzzing past the point of exhaustion. People slept when they were tired, which was usually shortly after dark. They slept deeply and well. Archaeological evidence suggests hunter-gatherers actually had better sleep than modern humans. They didn't suffer from chronic sleep deprivation. They didn't need alarm clocks to force themselves awake. Their bodies were synchronized with natural light and dark cycles in ways we've completely lost. But here's what's really remarkable about this lifestyle. It was stable, incredibly, almost impossibly stable. The basic pattern of hunter-gatherer life had existed for hundreds of thousands of years by 10,000 BCE. The tools changed, the techniques refined, but the fundamental lifestyle, small mobile bands, following seasonal resources, sharing food communally, organizing egalitarianly, this had worked for longer than recorded history. It had worked so well that there was no pressure to change it, until there was. Because even as bands in 10,000 BCE moved through their territories, following the ancient patterns that had sustained their ancestors for millennia, something was shifting. The climate was stabilizing after the chaos of the Ice Age. Megafauna were disappearing. And in a few key regions, people were starting to notice that certain plants they'd been gathering for thousands of years could be encouraged to grow more abundantly if you did certain things. If you scattered their seeds in good soil, if you cleared competing plants, if you watered them during dry periods. They didn't call it agriculture yet. They didn't know they were inventing it. They were just trying to make their gathering more efficient, to reduce the distance they had to travel for reliable food sources. But they were standing on the edge of the most dramatic transformation in human history. The transformation that would end the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that had defined our species for so long. The transformation that would create cities, states, and civilizations. The transformation that would change everything about what it meant to be human. But in 10,000 BCE, that was still just beginning. For now, most of humanity still moved with the seasons, still followed the herds, still gathered the ancient harvests. They were living the life that evolution had designed them for. And by all measures that matter, health, happiness, community, connection, they were remarkably successful at it. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, is that this success was about to make itself obsolete. The very abundance and security that the hunter-gatherer lifestyle provided would create the conditions for its own end. Home. For us it's a fixed point. an address, 4 walls and a roof that stay in the same place year after year. But for the people living in 10,000 BCE, home was something entirely different. Home was wherever you stopped moving, and everything about their material world, from the shelters they built to the clothes they wore to the tools they carried, was designed around one fundamental constraint. It all had to be portable. This wasn't a limitation. This was a philosophy, an entire approach to living that we've almost completely forgotten. The hunter-gatherers of the late Paleolithic didn't accumulate possessions. They curated them. Every object they owned had to justify its existence by being useful enough to carry for hundreds of miles. Nothing extra. Nothing decorative that wasn't also functional. Nothing that couldn't be replaced if it broke or wore out. Let's start with shelter, the most basic human need after water and food. When we think about prehistoric housing, we tend to imagine caves, dark openings in cliff faces where primitive humans huddled around fires, hiding from the dangers of the outside world. But that's mostly Hollywood fiction. Our ancestors used caves, sure, but they weren't the preferred option. Caves had serious problems. First, they were rare. Good caves, ones that were dry, defensible, and located near water and food sources, were few and far between. Second, they were fixed. If the game migrated or the water source dried up, you couldn't take your cave with you. Third, and perhaps most importantly, caves were often already occupied, not by other humans, but by the animals that actually preferred cave dwelling. Bears, big cats, hyenas, animals that were much better equipped than humans to fight for territory. So instead of relying on natural shelters, our ancestors became expert builders of temporary structures, shelters that could be constructed in a few hours, used for days or weeks, then abandoned without a second thought. The simplest form was the lean-to. Find a sturdy tree or large rock, lean long branches against it at an angle, cover the frame with smaller branches, leaves, bark, whatever vegetation was available. Maybe pile earth or stones along the bottom edge to seal it. You've just created a windbreak and rain shelter that would keep you reasonably comfortable in all but the worst weather. These weren't crude or primitive structures. They were elegant solutions to specific problems. A group of experienced builder-gatherers could construct a weatherproof lean-to in under an hour using only materials found within 100 yards of the site. They understood structural engineering in ways that would impress modern architects. Which angle provided the best rain runoff? How to position the shelter relative to prevailing winds? Where to dig drainage channels to prevent water from pooling underneath during storms? But lean-tos had limits. They worked fine for overnight camps or brief stops during seasonal migrations. For longer stays, especially during harsh weather, you needed something more substantial. Enter the hide tent. This was technology. Real, sophisticated technology that required planning, skill, and considerable labour to produce. The process started with hunting. Not just any hunt, but systematic harvesting of large animals specifically for their hides. Deer, elk, bison, aurochs, the giant wild cattle that roamed Europe and Asia. These animals provided skins large enough to create useful shelter material. But a freshly killed animal's hide is just bloody skin. Turning it into usable leather required knowledge that took years to acquire. First, you had to remove all the flesh and fat. This was done with specialized stone scrapers, tools with carefully shaped edges that could peel tissue away from the hide without damaging the skin itself. Archaeological sites from this period are littered with scrapers, thousands upon thousands of them, each one representing hours of careful work processing animal skins. Next came the tanning process. Without tanning, hide would dry into stiff, brittle material that would crack and rot within weeks. To prevent this, our ancestors used natural tanning agents, animal brains. Every animal's brain contains exactly enough oils and enzymes to tan its own hide. It's almost like nature designed it that way. The brain would be mashed into a paste, worked into the hide, then the whole thing would be stretched and softened through days of kneading and manipulation. The result was flexible, durable leather that could withstand rain, wind, and years of use. These tanned hides were precious resources. A single large hide might represent a week's worth of work by multiple people. So they were carefully maintained, repaired when damaged, and used until they literally fell apart. Groups would accumulate 10, 15, maybe 20 large hides over years of hunting. These became the walls and roof of more permanent encampments. The typical hide tent used a framework of wooden poles. In treeless areas, people would carry these poles with them, essential equipment too valuable to abandon. In forested regions, fresh poles could be cut as needed. Either way, the design was remarkably consistent across different cultures and continents. Poles arranged in a conical or dome shape, hides draped over the structure and secured with leather thongs, a smoke hole at the top, a doorway that could be sealed with an additional hide flap. Inside, the tent was surprisingly comfortable. Animal furs on the floor provided insulation from cold ground. A central fire pit, carefully positioned under the smoke hole, provided heat and light. The hide walls blocked wind while remaining breathable enough to prevent smoke accumulation. During winter in northern climates, people would pile snow or earth around the base of the tent for additional insulation. These structures could maintain interior temperatures 30 or 40 degrees warmer than outside, even in Arctic conditions. But not everyone built tents. In certain regions, people discovered they could use the landscape itself as building material. Rock overhangs, shallow caves that were too small for large predators, became seasonal camps where the same groups would return year after year. These sites show evidence of modification. Stone walls built to extend the overhang's protection, carved drainage channels to direct rainwater away from living areas, sometimes even primitive hearths, carefully constructed circles of stones that could contain fires and radiate heat efficiently. These semi-permanent camps were strategically located along migration routes. A group might have 4 or 5 such sites scattered across their territory. A summer camp near good fishing streams, a fall camp positioned to intercept migrating herds, a winter refuge in a protected valley, spring camps near areas where edible plants emerged early. The same families would use these spots for generations, each visit adding small improvements. A better windbreak here, a more efficient tool-making, station there. Over centuries, these locations accumulated the traces of human habitation, layers of ash from thousands of fires, discarded stone tools, fragments of worked bone, the archaeological signature of home. Now, shelter solved only part of the survival equation. Humans are tropical animals. We evolved in Africa without fur, without thick hides, without any natural protection against cold. Once our ancestors spread into temperate and Arctic regions, they faced a fundamental problem. How do you survive winter when your body isn't designed for it? The answer was clothing. But creating effective clothing with Paleolithic technology was incredibly complex. It started with the same hide processing we discussed earlier. But clothing required more flexible, lighter leather than tent material. The tanning process had to be more thorough. The hides had to be worked longer to achieve maximum suppleness, and then came the hardest part, sewing. Try this thought experiment. You need to attach 2 pieces of leather together. No thread, no needles, just stone tools. How do you do it? You could try cutting holes and lacing them together with strips of hide, but that creates gaps where cold air and water can penetrate. You could overlap the edges and glue them with plant resins, but that makes the seam stiff and prone to cracking. Our ancestors solved this problem with one of the most underappreciated inventions in human history, the bone needle. This tiny tool, usually made from bird or small mammal bones, represented a massive technological leap. Creating a bone needle required incredible precision. You had to select a suitable bone, usually something straight and dense. Grind it down using abrasive stones until you had a smooth, thin shaft. Then came the hard part, drilling a hole through the bone without breaking it. This was done by repeatedly drilling from both sides with a stone awl, a process that could take hours for a single needle. But with needles, suddenly you could create fitted clothing, shirts with sleeves, pants with legs, hoods that protected your head and face from biting wind. Archaeological evidence shows that by 10,000 BCE, people in northern climates were wearing sophisticated layered clothing. An inner layer of soft leather or fur against the skin, a middle layer of heavier hide for insulation, an outer layer of the toughest, most weather-resistant material for protection against wind and rain. This was climate engineering, using materials to create a portable micro-environment around your body. The sewing was done with sinew, the tough connective tissue from animal legs and backs. When fresh, sinew is pliable and can be threaded through a needle's eye. As it dries, it shrinks and hardens, creating a waterproof seam stronger than the leather itself. A skilled leather worker could sew for hours, creating garments so well made they would last for years. These weren't crude animal skins tied around the body. They were tailored, clothing designed for specific purposes and conditions. Different climates demanded different solutions. In Arctic regions, people learned to use caribou fur, which has hollow hairs that provide exceptional insulation. They discovered that wearing the fur with a hair facing inward created an air layer that dramatically improved warmth. In wetter climates, they developed rain cloaks from bird skins, the natural oils in the feathers shedding water like modern Gore-Tex. Desert peoples created loose, light clothing that provided shade while allowing air circulation. But clothing was more than protection from the elements. It was identity. The way you decorated your garments, the materials you used, the style of stitching, all communicated information about who you were, which group you belonged to, your status within that group, whether you were available for marriage. Certain types of beadwork might indicate a successful hunter. Specific patterns might mark you as a skilled healer or storyteller. This brings us to fire, the technology that made everything else possible. By 10,000 BCE, humans had been using fire for over 1 million years. But there's a huge difference between using fire and mastering it. Early humans were probably fire scavengers. They would harvest embers from natural fires started by lightning, then desperately try to keep those embers alive. Losing your fire meant waiting, possibly for months, until another lightning strike created a new source. But by the late Paleolithic, humans had learned to create fire on demand. Several techniques were in use. The fire drill was most common, a straight stick rotated rapidly against a flat piece of wood. The friction generates enough heat to ignite wood dust that accumulates in a small notch. But this isn't as simple as it sounds. You need exactly the right wood species. Too hard and you won't generate enough friction. Too soft and you'll just wear away the materials without creating heat. You need dry conditions. Moisture content above 15% makes fire starting exponentially harder. Most importantly, you need skill. The technique has to be perfect. The angle of the drill, the speed and consistency of rotation, the exact moment when you stop drilling and transfer the smouldering ember to your tinder bundle. Archaeological evidence suggests people would practice fire starting from childhood. It was too important to leave to chance. A competent firemaker could produce flames in 10 or 15 minutes under good conditions. A true expert could do it in under 5 minutes, even in light rain. The alternative was the striker-light method. Certain types of stone, particularly flint and iron pyrite, create sparks when struck together. These sparks could ignite specialized tinder. Char cloth, fabric that had been partially burned then sealed in an airtight container, would catch the smallest spark. Or punk wood, fungus-infected wood that burned slowly like incense. With practice, the striker light method was faster than fire drilling, but it required finding the right stones which weren't available in all regions. Once you had fire, the next challenge was keeping it. Mobile groups developed techniques for transporting fire between camps. Slow-burning fungus could smoulder for hours without flame. Carefully wrapped in green leaves and tucked into a leather pouch, it would stay alive during a day's travel. When you reached your destination, a few gentle breaths would bring it back to flame. Some groups carried fire drills as backup. Others relied on multiple people carrying separate embers, insurance against anyone's fire dying during travel. Fire was the centre of social life. You cooked over it, obviously. But it was also warmth on cold nights, light in the darkness, protection from predators. The fire was where stories were told, decisions were made, knowledge was passed between generations. Maintaining the fire was a communal responsibility. Someone always had to watch it, feed it, make sure it didn't go out or spread beyond its hearth. This created natural rhythms of social interaction. People taking shifts through the night, children learning fire management from adults, the entire group gathering when important discussions needed to happen. And fire enabled more advanced technology. You can't make effective stone tools without understanding fire. Heat treating certain types of stone makes them easier to work and produces sharper edges. Flint, when carefully heated, then slowly cooled, becomes almost glassy in texture. It flakes more predictably, allowing toolmakers to create more sophisticated implements. This heat treating required precise temperature control. Too hot and the stone would shatter. Too cool and it wouldn't change properties. This was chemistry and material science, prehistoric style. The stone tools themselves represented generations of accumulated knowledge. We call it knapping. The process of striking stones together to create sharp edges and useful shapes. But knapping is an art form. The stone napper had to understand geology, identify which stones had the right properties for different tools. They had to master biomechanics, the exact angle and force needed to remove flakes in controlled ways. They had to visualize the final form hidden inside the rough stone, like sculptors seeing their creation before the first chisel strike. The result was a sophisticated toolkit, hand axes for heavy cutting and butchering, scrapers with different edge angles for working wood versus leather, burins, specialized engraving tools for working bone and antler, microliths, tiny blade segments that could be set into wooden handles to create composite tools, spear points in various sizes for different prey. Each tool was designed for specific tasks, and most toolkits included 15 to 20 different implement types. These tools weren't just functional, they were often beautiful. Stone knappers would select materials with attractive colours and patterns. They would create symmetrical forms that required far more work than pure function demanded. Some hand axes show craftsmanship so refined they were probably never used for cutting, but served as trade goods or prestige items. This tells us something profound. Even living on the edge of survival, humans made art, created beauty, cared about aesthetics as much as utility. But tools and weapons were only part of the material culture. Equally important were containers. You can hunt the biggest deer, gather the finest berries, catch the most fish, but without containers, you can only consume what you can carry in your hands. Containers were force multipliers. They let you store food, transport water, accumulate resources beyond immediate needs, and creating them required yet another set of specialized skills. Basket weaving was probably the most important container technology. Using plant fibers, thin branches, or split roots, Weavers could create watertight containers without any adhesive or sewing. The technique was purely structural, fibers woven so tightly that surface tension held water. Different weave patterns created different properties. Tight weaves for liquids, looser weaves for allowing grain to breathe during storage, reinforced edges for carrying heavy loads. Basket making took years to master, but a skilled weaver could produce containers for any purpose. Leather pouches served similar functions with different advantages, more durable than baskets, waterproof when properly treated, better for carrying sharp tools that might damage woven containers. Most adults would own several pouches of various sizes, each designated for specific purposes: fire-starting materials in one, sewing supplies in another, food and small personal items in others. These pouches were often decorated with geometric patterns, beadwork, or dyed leather pieces, transforming practical objects into personal expression. And then there was personal adornment, jewellery. We find it at virtually every late Paleolithic site. Beads made from shells, even hundreds of miles from the ocean, pendants carved from bone or antler, necklaces strung with animal teeth, bracelets made from ivory or carved stone. This wasn't frivolous decoration. These items communicated complex information in societies where everyone you met might be a stranger. The shell beads proved you had trade connections to coastal regions. The number of animal teeth on your necklace might indicate your success as a hunter. Certain patterns or materials might mark clan affiliation or marital status. Creating these ornaments required the same precision and skill as making functional tools, drilling holes through shells or teeth without breaking them, carving intricate patterns into bone or ivory, stringing beads in specific patterns that held symbolic meaning. Some beads show evidence of being worn for years, even decades, passed down through generations as heirlooms. In a world where you could own only what you could carry, these small personal items became repositories of history and identity. This was the material world of 10,000 BCE. Everything reduced to essentials, but those essentials refined to perfection. A person might own only 20 or 30 objects total: a hide tent or the materials to build shelter, 2 or 3 sets of clothing, a selection of stone tools, a few containers, personal ornaments, fire-starting equipment, maybe a weapon or two. That was it. That was everything they owned in the entire world. But this minimalism created an intimacy with objects that we've completely lost. When you own only one knife, you know that knife. You know exactly how its edge feels, where it was napped and by whom, how many times it's been resharpened, what tasks it performs best. Every object had a history, a story, a relationship with its owner. Nothing was disposable, nothing was replaceable. Everything was maintained, repaired, cared for until it could no longer serve its purpose. This relationship with material goods shaped psychology in ways we can barely imagine. Our ancestors weren't poorer because they owned fewer things. They were richer because every object they owned was meaningful, essential, valued not for status or novelty, but for utility and craftsmanship. They lived lives of material simplicity, but cultural and spiritual complexity. Their homes were temporary, their possessions were minimal, but their knowledge of how to create, maintain, and use those possessions was vast. They were the original minimalists, not by choice, but by necessity. And in that necessity, they discovered a freedom we've forgotten, the freedom of mobility, the freedom from accumulation, the freedom to pick up and move when conditions changed, carrying everything they needed on their backs and in their hands. Home wasn't a place, it was the people you travelled with, the skills you carried in your mind, and the few precious objects that connected you to your past and your identity. Everything else was just the world around you, vast, wild, and always changing. Here's what's remarkable about human societies in 10,000 BCE. They had no kings, no chiefs with absolute authority, no formal hierarchies with people at the top giving orders to people at the bottom. For the vast majority of human existence, we lived without rulers. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't anarchy in the way we think of it today. It was something else entirely. A form of social organization so different from modern life that it's almost hard to imagine. But it worked. It worked for hundreds of thousands of years. Hunter-gatherer bands were fundamentally egalitarian, not because they had democratic ideals or political philosophies about equality. They were egalitarian because their lifestyle made hierarchy impossible to maintain. Think about it. If you don't have property beyond what you can carry, you can't accumulate wealth. If your survival depends on sharing food with your group, you can't hoard resources. If anyone can just walk away and join another band, you can't force people to obey you. The mobility and immediacy of hunter-gatherer life created natural checks against inequality. Sure, some people were better hunters than others. Some were more skilled at making tools or finding water or healing injuries. Everyone recognized these differences, but skill at hunting didn't translate into political power. Being a good toolmaker didn't give you authority over others. Expertise was respected, but respect didn't mean control. Instead, decisions got made through something that would look to us like an endless conversation. When a band needed to decide where to move next, or whether to stay at a good hunting ground, or how to handle a dispute between members, they talked about it. Everyone talked. The best hunters would share their observations about game movements. The most experienced women would discuss plant resources in different areas. Elders would recall what had happened in similar situations years or decades before. Children would listen, learning how decisions got made, and gradually, through this process of discussion and debate and sharing information, a consensus would emerge. Not unanimous agreement necessarily. There might be people who thought a different choice would be better. But consensus meant that everyone could live with the decision, that nobody felt so strongly opposed that they'd rather split off from the group. This sounds inefficient to modern ears. We're used to leaders who make quick decisions, organizational charts with clear lines of authority, systems where someone is in charge. But hunter-gatherer consensus decision-making had advantages that hierarchical systems lack. First, it meant everyone understood the reasons behind decisions. When you've participated in the discussion, you know why the group chose to move to the southern valley instead of staying near the lake. You've heard the arguments, weighed the evidence. This created buy-in. People supported decisions because they'd been part of making them. Second, it prevented catastrophically bad choices. In a hierarchy, if the person at the top makes a terrible decision, everyone suffers. In a consensus system, genuinely bad ideas got filtered out during discussion. Someone would point out the problems, share relevant experience, explain why that path led to danger or failure. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it maintained social cohesion. When everyone has voice in decisions, everyone feels invested in the group's success. There's no underclass of people who just follow orders. No resentment building up between those with power and those without. The social fabric stays strong because authority is distributed, not concentrated. But this doesn't mean there weren't leaders at all. There were. Just not permanent formal leaders with institutional authority. Instead, there were situational leaders, people who others look to in specific circumstances. The best tracker might lead during a hunt, with others following their instructions about how to approach prey or coordinate the kill. But once the hunt was over, that same person had no special authority around the campfire. An elder with deep knowledge of medicinal plants might lead when someone was sick, directing what to gather and how to prepare it. but they couldn't use that expertise to control other aspects of group life. This kind of fluid, situational leadership was incredibly effective because it meant the person with the most relevant knowledge and experience was guiding activity in any given situation. It was meritocratic in the truest sense. You led when you actually knew best, and only for as long as that knowledge was relevant. The anthropological term for this is heterarchy, as opposed to hierarchy. Multiple centres of authority depending on context, rather than a single pyramid of power. It's how humans organised ourselves for most of our history, and it shaped everything about how we lived together. Marriage in these societies was different too. Pair bonding was universal. Humans form lasting partnerships for child-rearing in every culture we know of. But marriage in 10,000 BCE didn't look like the institution we recognise today. There were no wedding ceremonies in the way we think of them, no legal contracts or property exchanges, no priests blessing unions. Instead, relationships formed through extended courtship, social recognition, and gradual integration. A young man and woman would show interest in each other. They'd spend time together, maybe going on food gathering trips as a pair, sitting together around fires, making it clear to the group that they were choosing each other. Eventually they'd start sharing a sleeping space, functioning as a partnership within the larger band. The group would recognise this as a marriage, not through any formal ceremony, but through acceptance. They were now a unit, expected to support each other, to share resources, to work together. But here's what's crucial. These partnerships existed within the larger framework of band cooperation. A married couple didn't form an isolated nuclear family unit. They remained embedded in the broader community. Children weren't raised just by their biological parents. They were raised by the entire band. The phrase, "it takes a village," is actually a pale echo of how child-rearing actually worked for most of human history. From the time a child could walk, they were everyone's responsibility. An infant might be primarily cared for by its mother, especially while nursing. But toddlers and older children moved freely through the camp, looked after by whoever was nearby. An aunt might spend the day teaching children how to dig for roots. An uncle might take them along on a short hunting trip, showing them how to track small game. Grandparents would tell stories, passing on crucial knowledge disguised as entertainment. This distributed parenting model had enormous advantages. First, it meant no parent was overwhelmed by childcare. Modern parents know the exhaustion of being solely responsible for small children 24 hours a day. Hunter-gatherers shared that burden across the entire community. A mother could focus on skilled tasks like processing hides or gathering medicine plants while other adults watched children. Second, it gave children access to more teachers and role models. Instead of learning everything from two parents, they learned from dozens of adults, each with their own expertise and experience. A child might learn fire-making from one adult, plant identification from another, stone tool-making from a third. This created remarkably well-rounded, competent people. Third, it built strong social bonds across the entire band. When everyone helps raise all the children, everyone becomes invested in everyone else's well-being. The children you helped teach to walk, whose scraped knees you bandaged, who listened to your stories, are all your children in a deep sense. This created social cohesion that went far beyond biological kinship. Children in these societies learned primarily through observation and participation, not formal instruction. There were no schools, no structured lessons, no teachers standing at the front explaining concepts. Instead, children watched adults work and played at adult activities until play became competence. A 3-year-old would watch adults making stone tools and play with rocks, imitating the motions. By 5, they might be helping gather stones of the right type. By 8, they'd be practicing on their own pieces, learning through trial and error. By 12, they could make functional tools, not as well as adults, but well enough to be useful. This learning through play and imitation was incredibly effective. Skills got transmitted naturally without the resistance that formal instruction often creates. Children wanted to learn because they wanted to be like the adults they admired, wanted to participate in important activities, wanted to be useful members of the community. And because learning happened gradually over years, starting from early childhood, people developed deep, intuitive expertise in survival skills. A woman who had been processing plant foods since she was 5 didn't just know how to do it. She could feel when the grinding was right, could tell at a glance which seeds were worth collecting, could process food efficiently while talking and watching children and planning tomorrow's gathering route. A man who had been tracking animals since he could walk didn't just know what prints meant. He could read landscapes like books, understanding at an almost subconscious level where game would be at different times of day and year. But bands didn't exist in isolation. Hunter-gatherer territories overlapped and connected, and these connections were maintained through regular gatherings. Several times a year, usually timed to coincide with seasonal abundance like salmon runs or nut harvests, multiple bands would come together at traditional meeting places. These gatherings served multiple crucial functions. First, they were marriage markets. Young people from different bands would meet potential partners. Since bands were small, typically 25 to 50 people, marrying within your own band meant marrying close relatives. Not good for genetic diversity. These larger gatherings provided opportunities to meet people from other groups, forming partnerships that would create alliances between bands. Second, they were trade fairs. Different territories had different resources. Coastal bands had shells and dried fish. Inland groups had good stone for tools or animal hides. Mountain dwellers might have collected obsidian or distinctive ochre for pigments. At gatherings, people would exchange these materials, not through formal commerce, but through gift-giving that created reciprocal obligations. You'd give someone a beautiful shell necklace. Later, they'd give you a fine knife. Both gifts were voluntary, but both also carried expectations of ongoing relationship. Third, these gatherings were information exchanges. Bands would share news about resource availability, dangerous animals in certain areas, new techniques for processing food or making tools. In a world without writing, these face-to-face meetings were how crucial survival information spread across regions. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, they were festivals. Times of celebration, feasting, music, dancing, storytelling. After months of small group life, these gatherings were explosions of social interaction. People would stay up late around fires, talking and laughing. There would be competitions, young men showing off their hunting or throwing skills. There would be artistic displays, people sharing new designs for decorating tools or bodies. There would be ceremonies marking important transitions, perhaps initiation rites for young people reaching adulthood. These gatherings reinforced the sense that individual bands were part of larger human networks, that you weren't just a member of your immediate group, but part of a broader community spread across the landscape. The bonds formed at these meetings could last lifetimes. People would look forward all year to seeing friends from other bands. They'd maintain relationships through the exchange of gift when territories overlapped. They'd remember people they'd met as children and meet again as adults with children of their own. This network of inter-band relationships created a kind of safety net. If your band faced disaster, maybe a disease outbreak or a failed hunting season, you could travel to allied bands and request hospitality. Because relationships had been maintained through years of gift exchange and periodic meetings, other bands would take you in, share their resources, help you survive until conditions improved. This wasn't guaranteed. Hospitality could be refused if relationships had been neglected, or if the receiving band was struggling themselves. But the network existed. It was real. And it made survival more likely for everyone. Central to all of this social cohesion was storytelling. Every evening after the work of survival was complete, people would gather around fires and talk. And much of that talk was stories. Stories about ancestors who had done remarkable things. Stories about how the world came to be. Stories about animals and spirits and the land itself. These weren't just entertainment, though they were definitely that. They were the primary technology for preserving and transmitting culture. Without writing, everything your society knew had to be remembered and shared verbally. Storytelling was how that happened. A story about an ancestor who survived a terrible drought by finding a hidden spring wasn't just family history. It was a lesson about water sources in your territory, about where to look when surface water disappeared. A story about a hunter who ignored warnings and was killed by a bear wasn't just tragedy. It was a teaching tool about respecting dangerous animals, about the importance of listening to experienced voices. The stories embedded practical knowledge in memorable narratives. They made information stick in human memory far more effectively than simple statements of fact. And because the stories were told and retold, often with slight variations by different tellers, they remained alive. They adapted to new circumstances while maintaining their core messages. Children heard these stories from their earliest years, the same tales told again and again, round fires season after season. By the time they were adults, they had internalized vast amounts of cultural knowledge without ever sitting through a formal lesson. The best storytellers were treasured members of communities, people who could tell stories well, who remembered all the details, who could make listeners laugh or cry or sit in tense silence, were performing crucial cultural work. They were human libraries, walking databases of everything the group needed to know, and often, though not always, the best storytellers were elders, older members of bands who had lived long enough to accumulate decades of experience and had heard all the old stories many times. Elders in hunter-gatherer societies held a position of enormous respect. Not formal authority, remember. They couldn't order people around any more than anyone else could, but their opinions carried weight in discussions. Their experience made them valuable advisors. A band facing a decision about where to move or how to handle a resource shortage would listen carefully to elders who had lived through similar situations before. Elders also served as mediators in conflicts. Disputes arose constantly in small group life. Someone took more than their fair share of meat. Two people both claimed they'd killed the same animal. Personalities clashed. Young people made reckless decisions. In a society without formal laws or police, how did these conflicts get resolved? Usually through social pressure and mediation. When a dispute arose, it would be discussed openly. The people involved would state their cases, others would offer opinions, and often respected elders would help guide the conversation toward resolution. They might point out precedents, remind people of similar situations in the past and how they were handled. They might appeal to shared values, emphasizing the importance of group harmony and cooperation. They might suggest compromises that both parties could accept. The goal wasn't punishment. There were no jails, no formal penalties to impose. The goal was restoration of social harmony. Getting people to a place where they could continue living and working together without ongoing resentment. This actually worked remarkably well most of the time. Because everyone knew that their survival depended on cooperation, there was strong motivation to resolve conflicts, and because shame and social disapproval were powerful forces in small face-to-face communities, people generally modified their behavior when the group consensus turned against them. If you consistently hoarded resources or started fights, or refused to contribute your share of work, you'd face increasing social isolation. People would stop sharing with you, stop including you in activities, stop considering you for partnerships. In a world where social connection meant survival, this was devastating pressure. But there were limits. Sometimes conflicts couldn't be resolved. Sometimes someone's behavior was so disruptive or dangerous that the group couldn't tolerate it. In extreme cases, the ultimate sanction was expulsion. The person would be forced to leave the band to survive on their own or find another group willing to accept them. This was rare. Exile was essentially a death sentence for most people. Humans aren't well equipped to survive alone for long periods. But the threat existed, and everyone knew it. This was the bottom line of hunter-gatherer social control. Cooperate and contribute, or eventually the group will cut you loose. For children growing up in these societies, life was remarkably free compared to modern standards. Children weren't segregated from adult life. They didn't spend their days in schools or structured activities. Instead, they had enormous independence within the safe boundaries of the band's camp area. Young children played endlessly, and their play was rarely interrupted by adults unless they were in actual danger. They climbed trees, swam in streams, built shelters from branches, invented games, got dirty. They were learning constantly through this play, developing physical skills, testing boundaries, understanding cause and effect. Older children gradually integrated into adult work. A 10-year-old might spend mornings playing with friends, afternoons helping gather firewood or process plant foods, evenings listening to adult conversations around fires. The transition from child to adult happened gradually, without the sharp boundary we impose today. By their mid-teens, young people were functioning as full members of the band. Not as experienced as older adults, but competent and contributing. Young women would have deep knowledge of plant resources, expert processing skills, and would often be mothers themselves by their late teens. Young men would be skilled hunters, capable toolmakers, ready to form partnerships and start contributing to the band in all the ways adults did. But even as young adults, they remained embedded in the broader community. They weren't expected to suddenly become independent, self-sufficient individuals. They were still part of the network of relationships that made survival possible, still learning from more experienced people, still supported by the group even as they contributed to it. This is what social life looked like for hundreds of thousands of years. Small groups of people connected by kinship and friendship and shared survival needs, making decisions together, raising children collectively, maintaining relationships with other bands across the landscape, preserving and transmitting knowledge through stories, respecting elders while giving everyone voice in decisions, resolving conflicts through discussion and social pressure rather than formal laws. It wasn't perfect. People still fought, still felt jealousy and resentment, still made mistakes that hurt others. Human nature included all the flaws and frailties we see today. But the social structures of hunter-gatherer life channeled those impulses in ways that maintained group cohesion. That prevented the accumulation of power and the emergence of inequality. That distributed both work and rewards across entire communities. These weren't naive people living in some imaginary paradise. They faced brutal challenges, constant uncertainty, real dangers, but they faced them together. And the social bonds they created were the strongest technology they possessed for ensuring survival. Stronger than any stone tool or hunting technique. Those bonds, that deeply human capacity for cooperation and mutual support, had carried them through the bottleneck, had spread humanity across the planet, and would soon, though they didn't know it yet, make possible an entirely new kind of society. One built not on movement and sharing, but on settlement and accumulation. The transformation was coming, but in 10,000 BCE, the old pattern still held. People still lived in those small mobile bands, still made decisions by consensus, still raised children as a community, still gathered around fires to tell the old stories. The original human networks were still strong, still functioning as they had for longer than anyone could remember. The world before walls was ending, but it didn't know it yet. But survival wasn't just about finding food and avoiding predators. Our ancestors were living in a world they needed to understand, a world that was often terrifying and inexplicable. Thunder that could shake the earth, lightning that could kill instantly, seasons that shifted without warning, animals that sometimes seemed to possess intelligence and intention, death that could arrive suddenly, taking loved ones without explanation. They needed answers. And in the absence of scientific understanding, they created something else. Something that would prove just as powerful in its own way. They created meaning. By 10,000 BCE, humans had developed sophisticated belief systems that explain their world, not through physics or chemistry, but through spirits and forces that inhabited everything around them. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was humanity's first organized attempt to make sense of existence, to find patterns in chaos, to assert some measure of control over forces that seemed utterly beyond human power. The worldview that dominated this period is what anthropologists call animism, the belief that everything possesses spirit, consciousness, or life force. Not just humans, not just animals, but plants, rivers, mountains, storms, even rocks and fire. Every element of the natural world was alive in its own way, possessed of intention and power. This might sound strange to modern ears, but it made perfect sense to people living intimately with nature. They watched animals behave with clear purpose and intelligence. They saw plants respond to seasons with what appeared to be intentional growth patterns. They witnessed rivers that could be calm one day and raging the next, as if possessed by changing moods. Mountains that seemed eternal, unmovable, powerful beyond comprehension. Why wouldn't these things have spirits? Why wouldn't they possess awareness? From an animistic perspective, the world wasn't divided into living and non-living, conscious and unconscious. Everything existed on a continuum of spiritual power. Some things, like large predators or dramatic weather phenomena, possessed obviously strong spirits. Others, like small stones or individual blades of grass, had smaller, quieter spirits. But everything was connected through this spiritual network. This belief system had profound practical implications. If everything possessed spirit, then everything required respect. You couldn't just take what you wanted from nature. You had to ask permission, offer gratitude, maintain proper relationships with the spiritual forces that controlled your survival. Archaeological evidence shows this in practice. At hunter-gatherer sites across the world, we find evidence of ritual behavior surrounding hunting. Offerings left at kill sites, animal bones arranged in specific patterns, cave paintings that seem to depict not just the hunt itself, but some kind of spiritual relationship between human and prey. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain aren't just ancient graffiti. They're spiritual sites, places where humans went to commune with the animal spirits they depended on for survival. Created between 17,000 and 15,000 BCE, these paintings show remarkable sophistication. Artists used the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. They depicted animals in motion, capturing the essence of their movement and power. But they weren't creating art for art's sake. These caves were sacred spaces, difficult to access, deep underground, away from living areas. The paintings often appear in chambers that would have been pitch black, requiring torches or stone lamps to see. Some are in spaces so cramped that only one or two people could view them at a time. This was hunting magic, shamanic practice, a way of connecting with animal spirits before the hunt, ensuring success, showing respect, maintaining the spiritual relationships that allowed humans to take animal lives for survival. By painting the animals in these sacred spaces, by performing rituals around these images, hunters believed they could influence the spirit world, making the animals more willing to give themselves as prey. And it worked. Not because spirits actually intervened, but because the ritual itself served crucial psychological and social functions. It created confidence before dangerous hunts. It reinforced group bonds through shared ceremony. It provided meaning and purpose to the killing that was necessary for survival, transforming it from mere butchery into sacred exchange. But humans weren't just communicating with animal spirits through art. They had developed specialized individuals who could bridge the gap between the human and spirit worlds more directly. Shamans. Shamanism appears in hunter-gatherer societies across the globe, from Siberia to the Amazon, from Australia to North America. The specifics vary, but the basic pattern is remarkably consistent. Certain individuals, often those who had survived near-death experiences or displayed unusual psychological traits, were recognized as having special abilities to communicate with spirits. These shamans used various techniques to enter altered states of consciousness: rhythmic drumming that could induce trance, fasting that created visions, hallucinogenic plants that opened doorways to the spirit world, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, ritualized dancing that continued until exhaustion brought transcendent experiences. In these altered states, shamans believed they could leave their bodies, travel to the spirit realm, and negotiate with the forces that controlled human destiny. They could intercede with animal spirits to ensure successful hunts. They could journey to retrieve lost souls of the sick. They could communicate with ancestor spirits who watched over the community. They could predict weather patterns by consulting storm spirits. Were they actually communicating with real spirits? That's not the right question. What matters is that everyone believed they were, and this belief shaped behavior in profound ways. When a shaman said the caribou spirits demanded certain offerings, people made those offerings. When a shaman declared a particular location sacred, it became off-limits for ordinary activities. When a shaman performed healing rituals over the sick, the psychological impact alone probably improved outcomes. The archaeological evidence for shamanic practice goes back tens of thousands of years. Burial sites containing what appear to be shamanic toolkits, animal bones, unusual stones, objects with no obvious practical purpose but clear symbolic significance. Cave paintings that seem to depict therianthropes, beings that are part human and part animal, possibly representing shamans in their transformed spiritual states. By 10,000 BCE, shamanism was likely the dominant spiritual technology in human societies, the primary way people understood and interacted with the forces that shaped their lives. But shamans weren't the only evidence that our ancestors believed in realms beyond the physical. The most compelling proof comes from how they treated their dead. Humans have been deliberately burying their dead for at least 100,000 years. But by 10,000 BCE, burial practices had become elaborate, suggesting complex beliefs about what happened after death. Bodies weren't just disposed of. They were carefully prepared, positioned in specific ways, accompanied by grave goods that the deceased might need in whatever came next. At burial sites across the Middle East and Europe, we find bodies placed in fetal positions, perhaps representing rebirth into another existence. We find them facing particular directions, possibly toward ancestral homelands or rising sun. We find them covered in red ochre, a pigment that required effort to obtain and process, suggesting ritual significance. Most tellingly, we find grave goods, tools, weapons, jewelry, food offerings. Why bury valuable items with the dead unless you believe they were going somewhere they might need them? This is clear evidence that by 10,000 BCE, humans had developed concepts of an afterlife, some form of continued existence beyond physical death. Some burials show even more elaborate beliefs. Bodies interred with specific animals, suggesting totemic relationships or spiritual protection. Multiple individuals buried together in ways that suggest they were expected to remain companions in death. Children buried with extraordinary care and rich grave goods, indicating beliefs about the spiritual status of the young. This isn't just ritual, it's theology. These people had developed complex ideas about the nature of existence, the relationship between body and spirit, the journey that awaited after death. They were wrestling with the same existential questions that would occupy philosophers and theologians for millennia to come. And they weren't just concerned with death, they had identified certain landscapes as spiritually significant, places where the boundary between human and spirit worlds grew thin, sacred landscapes. Every hunter-gatherer society had them, mountain peaks where one could get closer to sky spirits, deep caves that descended into the underworld, springs that seemed to connect to mysterious underground waters, ancient trees that had witnessed generations, rock formations that seemed too perfectly shaped to be natural accidents. These weren't just pretty locations. They were portals, places where shamans went to seek visions, where communities gathered for seasonal ceremonies, where young people underwent vision quests to find their spiritual purpose. The landscape itself was mapped not just geographically, but spiritually, with certain places marked as powerfully sacred, others as dangerous, others as neutral. We can see this in how archaeological sites cluster around particular features. Burial grounds placed near distinctive rock formations, ritual objects deposited in specific caves generation after generation. Rock art concentrated in locations that seem to have been revisited repeatedly over thousands of years. These sacred sites served crucial social functions. They were neutral territories where different groups could gather without territorial conflict. They were repositories of cultural knowledge, places where stories were told and retold, where traditions were passed to new generations. They were anchors of identity, connecting communities to landscapes and to the ancestors who had used these same sites before them. But perhaps the most important spiritual technology our ancestors possessed was closer and more intimate than any external ritual. It was dreams. Modern people tend to dismiss dreams as random neural firing, meaningless brain activity during sleep. But for hunter-gatherers, dreams were messages, windows into the spirit world, ways of receiving guidance and understanding that wasn't available through ordinary consciousness. When you dreamed of an animal, it might be that animal's spirit trying to communicate with you. When you dreamed of a deceased relative, they might be visiting from the afterlife with warnings or advice. When you dreamed of unfamiliar landscapes, you might be seeing places you would actually visit in the future, your spirit ranging ahead to scout the terrain. This wasn't superstition, it was epistemology, a way of knowing. In a world without writing, without formal education systems, without scientific method, dreams provided a channel for unconscious pattern recognition to surface as conscious awareness. Your brain might notice subtle signs of weather change that your conscious mind missed, and present that knowledge as a dream about storm spirits approaching. You might unconsciously register that certain areas had good hunting, and dream about animal spirits leading you there. Shamans particularly relied on dreams and visions. Many shamanistic cultures required apprentice shamans to undertake vision quests. Extended periods of isolation, fasting, and sensory deprivation designed to induce powerful dreams or waking visions. These experiences would reveal their spirit helpers, the animal or elemental spirits that would guide their shamanic work. They would receive their calling, their spiritual purpose through these visions. But ordinary people also paid attention to their dreams. A hunter who dreamed of a particular location might convince his group to travel there, expecting to find game. A woman who dreamed of a particular plant might search for it, believing the plant spirit had called to her. When these intuitions proved correct, and they often did because they were based on real, if unconscious knowledge, it reinforced the belief that dreams were genuine spiritual communication. All of these beliefs, animism, shamanism, sacred landscapes, dream guidance, came together in ritual and ceremony. The structured practices that marked important transitions and events in individual and community life. Seasonal ceremonies were particularly important. The spring equinox, when plants began growing again, the summer solstice, when days were longest, the autumn harvest, when certain plants produced seeds and nuts, the winter solstice, when the sun's decline finally reversed. These weren't just calendar markers. They were spiritual events requiring proper acknowledgement and ritual. Communities would gather at sacred sites for these seasonal ceremonies. Shamans would perform rituals to thank the spirits for past abundance and request their favor for the coming season. There would be feasting, dancing, the retelling of sacred stories, the performance of ritual dramas that reenacted creation myths or important historical events. These gatherings served multiple functions. They synchronized group activities, ensuring everyone was ready to exploit seasonal resources at optimal times. They reinforced social bonds, bringing together dispersed bands into large communities. They provided opportunities for young people to find mates outside their immediate kin group. They allowed for trade and exchange of information about distant territories. But they were also genuinely spiritual events. People believed that performing these rituals correctly was essential for continued survival. If you failed to honor the spirits properly, they might withhold their gifts. The animals might not return. The plants might not grow. The rains might not come. Life transition ceremonies were equally important. Birth rituals to welcome new souls into the community and protect them from malevolent spirits. Coming-of-age ceremonies marking the transition from childhood to adulthood, often involving vision quests or tests of courage that would reveal an individual's spiritual purpose. Marriage ceremonies binding not just two individuals but two families, creating alliances that might span vast territories. Death ceremonies, ensuring the deceased spirit could successfully journey to the afterlife without harming the living. And then there were the immediate responsive ceremonies, rituals performed after successful hunts to thank the animal spirits and ask forgiveness for taking life. Healing ceremonies when someone fell ill, aimed at retrieving lost souls or expelling malevolent spirits. Ceremonies to appease spirits when something went wrong, a hunting accident, an unexpected death, a mysteriously failed food source. These weren't empty performances. They were deadly serious attempts to maintain proper relationships with the forces that controlled existence. When you live without agriculture, without stored food, without any buffer against environmental disaster, you need all the help you can get. If performing the right rituals might make the difference between feast and famine, between life and death, then you perform those rituals with absolute commitment. The sophistication of these belief systems shouldn't surprise us. These were people with the same cognitive abilities we possess today, the same capacity for abstract reasoning, symbolic thinking, complex planning. They were applying those abilities to the questions that mattered most. Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? What forces control our destiny? They developed answers that made sense within their experience. A world alive with spirits, sacred specialists who could navigate the unseen realms, rituals that could influence outcomes, dreams that provided guidance, landscapes that connected earth and spirit, ceremonies that marked the rhythm of existence. These beliefs would persist for millennia. Even as humans developed agriculture, built cities, created complex civilizations, the old animistic worldview would continue echoing through human culture. It would evolve into the polytheistic religions of ancient civilizations, gods and goddesses, who were really just spirits of natural forces elevated to cosmic status. It would influence the development of monotheism, which kept the idea of an unseen spiritual realm, even as it reduced its population to a single deity. But here at 10,000 BCE, on the eve of agriculture, humans were still living in an enchanted world, a world where everything was alive, where spirits moved through forests and rivers, where dreams brought messages from realms beyond ordinary perception, where the proper ritual might mean the difference between survival and death. They were wrong about the mechanics. There weren't actually spirits controlling the weather or deciding whether hunts succeeded, but they were right about something deeper. That existence was mysterious, that humans needed meaning as much as food, that the invisible bonds connecting people to each other and to their environment were as real as any physical resource. They had created humanity's first answer to the eternal questions, and it was working. Imagine waking up with a toothache in 10,000 BCE, no dentist to call, no painkillers in the medicine cabinet, no medicine cabinet at all, just you, the pain, and whatever knowledge your community has accumulated over thousands of years about plants that might help. This was healthcare before civilization, and it was far more sophisticated than you might think. The human body in 10,000 BCE was a fundamentally different machine than what most of us inhabit today. Not genetically, the DNA was essentially identical, but functionally, physically, the difference was staggering. These people moved constantly, not exercise for health, not working out, just living. Every day involved walking miles to check trap lines, gather food, or move camp. Every meal required hours of physical labor to acquire and process. Every tool, every piece of clothing, every shelter component had to be carried or crafted by hand. The result was bodies that would make modern athletes jealous. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains shows bone density and muscle attachment points that indicate extraordinary physical strength. Not bodybuilder bulk, but lean, functional power. The kind of fitness that comes from using your entire body as a tool for survival every single day. Women's skeletons show upper body development comparable to modern competitive rowers. Men's leg bones indicate the kind of endurance that today we only see in ultramarathon runners. These weren't people who got fit. Fitness was simply what human bodies became when they were used the way evolution designed them to be used. But such constant physical activity came with costs. Skeletal remains from this period show evidence of wear and tear that would horrify modern orthopedic surgeons. Joint damage from repetitive stress, compression fractures in the spine from carrying heavy loads, healed breaks that hadn't quite set right. The human body is remarkably durable, but it's not invincible. Use it hard enough for long enough, and it starts to show the damage. Yet here's what's remarkable. These injuries weren't death sentences. Archaeological sites contained skeletons showing major trauma that had healed. Leg bones broken and mended, though sometimes at odd angles. Skull fractures that had closed over. Even evidence of amputations that hadn't led to fatal infections. This tells us something profound. These people knew how to treat injuries. They understood enough about the human body to set bones, manage wounds, and nurse their injured back to health. More than that, they cared enough to do it. Because healing a major injury in 10,000 BCE meant months of being unable to contribute to the group's survival. It meant being dead weight in a world where every person's labour mattered. The fact that people survived these injuries means their communities kept them alive. They shared food with those who couldn't hunt. They carried those who couldn't walk. They had developed what we might call proto-medicine, practical knowledge about treating trauma that had been accumulated over millennia and passed down through demonstration and instruction. Part of that knowledge involved plants, lots of plants. The botanical expertise of hunter-gatherer peoples was encyclopedic in scope. Modern ethnographic studies of surviving hunter-gatherer groups have documented knowledge of hundreds of plant species, their uses, their properties, their dangers. And this knowledge wasn't superficial. They understood which plants reduced inflammation, which ones fought infection, which could be used to clean wounds or reduce fever or ease pain. Archaeological evidence supports this. Analysis of residues on ancient tools has found traces of medicinal plants. Neanderthal remains, our closest evolutionary cousins, show dental calculus containing chamomile and yarrow, both plants with medicinal properties but terrible taste. Nobody was eating those for pleasure. They were taking medicine. By 10,000 BCE, modern humans had tens of thousands of years of accumulated botanical knowledge. They knew that willow bark reduced pain and fever because it contained salicylic acid, the same compound we now synthesize as aspirin. They knew that honey prevented wound infections because of its natural antibacterial properties. They understood that certain molds and fungi could be applied to wounds to prevent festering, anticipating the discovery of penicillin by 12,000 years. They didn't know the chemistry or the mechanisms, they just knew what worked. And that was enough. When someone got injured, the community's healers, usually older individuals who had spent decades learning plant lore, would treat them with sophisticated herbal remedies. Poultices to draw out infection, teas to reduce fever, salves to promote healing. It wasn't modern medicine, but it was medicine nonetheless. And it worked well enough to keep people alive through injuries and illnesses that would certainly have killed them without intervention. But some things their medicine couldn't fix. Serious infections remained deadly. Without antibiotics, a simple cut could become septic and kill within days. Pneumonia, appendicitis, severe dysentery. These conditions carried mortality rates that would be unthinkable today. Disease patterns in 10,000 BCE looked nothing like what we face now. The epidemic diseases that would ravage agricultural civilizations hadn't emerged yet. Measles, smallpox, typhoid, cholera, all the great killers of human history required dense populations to sustain transmission chains. Hunter-gatherer bands were too small and too dispersed for most epidemic diseases to spread effectively. If someone in your 30-person band got sick, you might all catch it, but then the disease would burn out. There was no neighbouring village to spread it to, no trade network carrying pathogens across continents. This meant that certain causes of death were actually quite rare. Pandemic diseases that would later kill millions weren't significant factors in hunter-gatherer mortality. Instead, the health challenges were different. Parasitic infections were common. Archaeological analysis of coprolites, fossilized feces, shows evidence of intestinal worms and other parasites, not usually fatal, but debilitating, causing anemia, malnutrition, reduced energy, chronic issues that made survival harder without actually killing you outright. Zoonotic diseases, infections transmitted from animals, were constant risks. Handling carcasses, living in close proximity to wild animals, these activities expose people to pathogens that their immune systems had to fight off continuously. Fungal infections from damp conditions, bacterial infections from contaminated water, viral infections that spread within bands but couldn't jump to the next group. The disease burden was real, just different from what would come later. Interestingly, some modern health problems were virtually non-existent. Dental health, surprisingly, was relatively good, not perfect. Skeletal remains show evidence of cavities, abscesses, and tooth loss, but the rates of dental disease were far lower than what would emerge after agriculture. Why? No refined sugars. The bacteria that cause tooth decay thrive on simple carbohydrates and sugars. Hunter-gatherer diets contained very little of either, mostly protein, complex carbohydrates, and fiber. Yes, they ate honey when they could find it. Yes, they consumed seasonal fruits. But the constant sugar exposure that defines modern diets didn't exist. Their teeth wore down from grinding tough foods and using their mouths as tools for gripping and processing materials, but they didn't rot at the rates we see in later agricultural populations. Archaeological studies comparing hunter-gatherer teeth to those from early farming communities show a dramatic increase in cavities after the adoption of agriculture. The shift to grain-based diets heavy in carbohydrates created perfect conditions for dental decay. People in 10,000 BCE were living in the last moments before that transition. Their teeth, while worn, were relatively healthy, at least until something went catastrophically wrong. A dental abscess without modern treatment could be excruciating and eventually fatal. Some skeletal remains show evidence of crude dentistry. Holes drilled into infected teeth, possibly to drain abscesses. Whether this provided real relief or just added trauma to injury, we can't be certain. But it shows they were trying. The most dangerous time in any person's life was the beginning, and for women, the act of creating new life. Infant mortality in 10,000 BCE was staggeringly high by modern standards. Estimates suggest that 40 to 50% of children died before reaching age 5. Some from infections, some from injuries, some from malnutrition during lean seasons, some from causes we can only guess at. The archaeological record is full of small graves, tiny skeletons laid to rest with care, sometimes with offerings, always with evidence that these deaths mattered deeply to their communities. Childbirth itself was a life-threatening event. Without modern obstetrics, complications that today are routine emergencies could be fatal. Breech births, placental problems, postpartum hemorrhage, these conditions killed both mothers and babies with tragic regularity. Maternal mortality rates were probably around 1 in 100 births, which might not sound terrible until you remember that many women gave birth 5, 6, 7 times over their reproductive lives. Cumulative risk added up. Yet they had developed practices to improve outcomes. Experienced women attended births, providing support and assistance. They understood birthing positions that used gravity effectively. They knew herbs that could stimulate contractions or reduce bleeding. They provided emotional comfort during the most vulnerable moments of life. Childbirth was never a solitary experience in 10,000 BCE. It was a communal event surrounded by knowledge, support, and hope that both mother and child would survive. When someone died, especially someone young, the grief was real and profound. Burial sites from this period show evidence of emotion. Bodies positioned carefully, grave goods included. Sometimes flower pollen, preserved in the soil, indicating that graves were decorated with blooms. These people didn't just dispose of their dead. They mourned them, they remembered them, they cared. But here's what might surprise you. If you survived childhood in 10,000 BCE, your prospects weren't bad. The average life expectancy statistics are misleading. When we say life expectancy was 30 to 35 years, that number is heavily weighted by infant and child mortality. It doesn't mean everyone died at 35. It means lots of children died very young, bringing the average down. But someone who made it to adulthood had a reasonable chance of living to 60 or even 70. Skeletal remains from hunter-gatherer sites include individuals who were clearly elderly, teeth worn down to nubs, joints showing advanced arthritis, bones displaying the accumulated damage of decades of hard use. These people had survived everything their world could throw at them for 6 or 7 decades. They were repositories of knowledge and experience. They knew things that younger people couldn't possibly know because they'd lived through rare events, survived unusual dangers, learned from decades of trial and error. Elders in hunter-gatherer societies weren't just tolerated, they were valued. Their knowledge of medicinal plants, seasonal patterns, distant resources, and survival strategies made them essential to their communities. The same culture that cared for injured individuals for months kept elderly people alive and integrated into social life, even when they could no longer contribute physically. This wasn't sentiment, it was practical. An elder who knew where to find water during droughts or which plants were edible during famines was more valuable to group survival than the strongest young hunter. And that brings us to something remarkable about health and disability in 10,000 BCE. We have archaeological evidence of people surviving conditions that should have killed them. A Neanderthal skeleton from Shanidar Cave in Iraq shows massive injuries. A crushing blow to the head, a withered arm that was probably paralyzed from birth or early injury. Yet this individual lived to be around 40 to 45 years old. He couldn't have survived without extensive help from his community. Someone who couldn't hunt or gather effectively had to be provided for. Someone with significant disabilities required accommodation and care, yet they received it. A burial from Ramito Cave in Italy, dating to about 10,000 BCE, contained the skeleton of a young man with a severe congenital condition causing dwarfism. He was part of a double burial, laid to rest alongside another individual with care and ceremony. His skeleton shows he survived to his late teens, which means his community kept him alive despite physical limitations that would have prevented him from participating in normal adult activities. Other sites show evidence of healed amputations, individuals missing hands or feet, with the bones showing clear signs of healing, meaning they survived for years after losing the limb. This wasn't battlefield surgery. There were no trained trauma surgeons. These were probably injuries from accidents, animal attacks perhaps, or crushing damage that left no option but to remove the damaged tissue. The fact that people survived these procedures and lived for years afterward tells us that their communities had developed effective wound management and infection control, and that they chose to care for permanently disabled members rather than abandon them. This reveals something profound about human nature before civilization. The idea that pre-agricultural life was brutally Darwinian, that only the strong survived, that disabled or elderly individuals were left behind to die. It's not supported by evidence. The archaeological record shows consistent care for vulnerable community members, because humans are social creatures. Our survival strategy has always been cooperation, not ruthless individualism. A band that abandoned injured members would quickly lose cohesion. People wouldn't take risks in hunting if they knew a serious injury meant death. They wouldn't develop innovations if they couldn't pass knowledge to the next generation. They wouldn't form the deep social bonds that made human groups effective survival units. But mental health is harder to trace in the archaeological record. Bones preserve. Psychological states don't. We can only infer mental health patterns from what we know about human psychology and the conditions people lived under. The truth is probably complicated. On one hand, hunter-gatherer life provided many things that modern psychology considers important for mental well-being. Strong social connections, regular physical activity, time spent in nature, a sense of purpose and meaning through daily survival activities, clear social roles and responsibilities. On the other hand, the stresses were immense. Constant food insecurity, the death of children and loved ones, physical danger from animals and environmental hazards, the pressure of knowing that your mistakes could kill not just yourself but your entire family. Modern studies of surviving hunter-gatherer groups show rates of depression and anxiety that are generally lower than in industrial societies, but not absent. People still experienced grief, trauma, fear, and despair. They just experience these things in different contexts and with different support systems. When someone in a hunter-gatherer band experienced what we might call mental illness, the community's response was probably similar to their response to physical illness. Accommodation, support, perhaps treatment with psychoactive plants that could alter consciousness or mood. Many cultures developed shamanistic traditions where individuals who experienced unusual mental states were channeled into spiritual roles. Whether this represented genuine healing or just a way to integrate people who might otherwise be outcast, we can't know for certain. But it suggests that communities found ways to make space for psychological diversity. The evidence suggests that people in 10,000 BCE understood that mental and physical health were connected, that isolation and despair could be as dangerous as infected wounds, that keeping people integrated into community life served everyone's survival. So they did. They told stories around fires, they created art together, they celebrated successful hunts and mourned losses as groups. They maintained the social fabric that made human survival possible, not just physically but psychologically. This was healthcare without hospitals, healing without doctors, medicine without pharmaceuticals. It wasn't perfect. People died from conditions we could easily treat today. Children died at rates that would be unthinkable now. Pain and suffering that we can eliminate with a pill had to be endured or managed with far less effective treatments. But it was more sophisticated than we often give it credit for. These people had accumulated thousands of years of medical knowledge. They understood human anatomy from butchering animals and treating injuries. They knew pharmacology from testing plants. They practiced surgery, nursing, and physical therapy. They developed communities that cared for their vulnerable members. They survived and even thrived without any of the medical technologies we consider essential. When we look at health in 10,000 BCE, we're seeing the last moment of a medical tradition that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years. The accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had learned through trial and error what kept people alive. In just a few thousand years, the agricultural revolution would transform human health in ways both positive and negative. Population density would bring epidemic diseases. Grain-based diets would cause dental decay and nutritional deficiencies. But specialization would also allow dedicated healers to develop more sophisticated treatments. Writing would preserve medical knowledge across generations. Eventually, we'd develop the scientific medicine that allows most of us to survive conditions that would have killed our ancestors. But we'd also lose something: the intimate knowledge of medicinal plants, the physical robustness that came from constant activity, the tight social support networks that provided mental health care simply through being human together. People in 10,000 BCE weren't healthier than us. They weren't living better lives, but they were managing the universal challenges of human existence, illness, injury, pain, mortality, with the tools they had. And those tools, limited as they were enough to carry our species through hundreds of thousands of years and bring us to the threshold of the greatest transformation in human history. By 10,000 BCE, something was changing. Not dramatically, not suddenly. But if you could have watched human societies across the entire globe over the span of a few thousand years, you would have noticed patterns emerging. Patterns that would have been invisible to the people living them, but that would eventually transform everything about human existence. The world was warming, not uniformly, not everywhere at once, but the great ice sheets that had dominated the northern latitudes for over 100,000 years were retreating. Glaciers that had covered half of Europe were melting back toward the poles. Sea levels were rising, flooding coastal plains and creating new islands. Rivers were flowing where there had been only frozen tundra. Forests were spreading into regions that had been grassland for millennia. For hunter-gatherers living through this transition, it must have seemed gradual. Maybe your grandparents talked about winters that used to be harsher. Maybe your parents mentioned hunting grounds that had been tundra but were now covered in trees. These changes played out over human lifetimes, slow enough that each generation could adapt, but fast enough that the world your great-grandchildren inhabited would be fundamentally different from the one you'd known as a child. The warming climate was creating new opportunities. Regions that had been marginal for human habitation were becoming more productive. Plant communities were shifting northward, bringing new food sources into territories that had previously offered slim pickings. Animal populations were exploding in some areas as grazing lands expanded. The early Holocene, the geological epoch that began around 11,700 years ago, was turning out to be remarkably favourable for human life. But it was also creating new pressures, because humans, those descendants of Bottleneck, survivors who had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting their adaptation to challenging environments, were thriving too. Populations were growing, slowly, imperceptibly to anyone living through it, but growing nonetheless. Here's the thing about hunter-gatherer populations. They naturally regulate themselves. Women who are constantly on the move, carrying children and equipment, spacing their pregnancies wider than settled populations would. High infant mortality keeps population growth in check. The availability of resources sets natural limits on group size. For hundreds of thousands of years, these factors had kept human populations relatively stable. But now those equations were starting to change. The warming climate meant more reliable food sources. Better nutrition meant healthier mothers and higher infant survival rates. More abundant resources meant groups could stay in the same general area longer, which meant women didn't have to carry small children as far or as often. Birth spacing could narrow slightly, not dramatically. A woman might have 6 children instead of 4 over her reproductive lifetime. Doesn't sound like much, but compound that over a few dozen generations and you've got significant population growth. By 10,000 BCE, there were probably somewhere between 5 and 10 million humans on Earth. That's still vanishingly small by modern standards. If you distributed them evenly across the inhabitable land area, there would be 1 person per square kilometre. You could walk for days without seeing another human being in most regions. But humans weren't distributed evenly. They clustered in the good spots, river valleys, coastal areas, places where multiple ecosystems met and resources were particularly abundant. And in these favoured locations, population density was starting to create something that humans had rarely experienced before: sustained competition for resources. This is where the story gets interesting, because humans faced with resource pressure had basically 3 options. They could move somewhere else. They could develop new technologies to exploit existing resources more efficiently, or they could find ways to increase the productivity of their environment. For hundreds of thousands of years, option 1 had been the default. Resources getting scarce, move to the next valley. That band using the hunting grounds you wanted, head west and find unclaimed territory. The world was big and humans were few. There was always somewhere else to go. But by 10,000 BCE, the map was filling in. Not everywhere. There were still vast regions of the Americas, Australia and interior Asia, with low population densities. But in certain regions, particularly in the Middle East, parts of East Asia and Mesoamerica, the really prime territories were starting to get crowded. Groups that had traditionally ranged over hundreds of square kilometres were finding their movements constrained by other groups doing the same thing. Water sources that had been shared casually were becoming contested. Hunting territories were developing boundaries, not formal property lines. No one had invented those yet, but understood zones where your band could operate without conflict, and areas where you'd be encroaching on someone else's territory. This pressure was pushing humans toward options 2 and 3. and some groups were starting to experiment with something revolutionary. In the Levant, the region encompassing modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Jordan, something remarkable was happening with a culture archaeologists called the Natufians. These people, living between about 15,000 and 11,500 years ago, were starting to blur the lines between hunting-gathering and something else entirely. The Natufians lived in a particularly favourable environment. The climate there had become Mediterranean, warm and wet enough to support dense stands of wild grains, wheat and barley, that grew so thickly in some areas that you could gather enough seeds in a few weeks to feed a family for months. Wild gazelle herds migrated through the region in massive numbers. The Jordan River and numerous seasonal streams provided reliable water and aquatic resources. It was, in short, too good to leave, so the Natufians didn't. Instead of moving with the seasons across vast territories, they began establishing what archaeologists call base camps. These weren't quite permanent villages yet, but they were more substantial than typical hunter-gatherer camps. Stone foundations for circular huts, storage pits dug into bedrock, cemeteries where generation after generation buried their dead. Some Natufian sites show evidence of year-round occupation. People were staying in the same place through all 4 seasons, something virtually unheard of for hunter-gatherers. Other sites were more seasonal, occupied during the wild grain harvest in late spring and early summer, then abandoned during the lean winter months. But even these seasonal camps were being reused year after year, generation after generation. And the Natufians were investing in infrastructure. They created grinding stones for processing grain, heavy basalt implements that could weigh 30 or 40 pounds. You don't carry those around if you're moving camp every few weeks. You leave them in place and return to them. They developed specialized harvesting tools, curved flint blades set into bone handles with plant resin, perfect for efficiently cutting wild grain stalks. They built storage facilities, underground pits lined with stone and clay to keep grain dry through the winter. Most tellingly, they were managing the landscape. Genetic analysis of wild wheat and barley from Natufian sites shows these grains were beginning to change in ways that only make sense if humans were selectively harvesting them. Seeds were getting larger. Seed heads were retaining their seeds longer instead of shattering and scattering them naturally. These are the first signs of domestication, though the Natufians probably had no concept that they were changing these plants. They weren't planting organized fields. They weren't fully agricultural yet, but they were paying attention to where the best stands of grain grew. They were probably pulling up competing plants to give their favourite food sources more room. Maybe they were scattering some seeds in areas that looked favourable. Not farming exactly. More like very intensive management of wild resources, and it was working. Natufian sites show evidence of population densities far higher than typical hunter-gatherers. Some settlements might have housed 150 to 200 people, large by any hunter-gatherer standard. They had more possessions, more elaborate burials, more specialized tools. They were developing social complexity that would have been impossible for mobile hunter-gatherers. But they were also experiencing something new and not entirely pleasant. For the first time in human history, there's clear archaeological evidence of social inequality. Some Natufian burials are elaborate, with shell beads, carved bone ornaments, and valuable stone tools. Others are simple interments with no grave goods. This suggests some individuals or families had accumulated more resources and higher status than others. That's virtually unknown among mobile hunter-gatherers, where accumulating possessions is pointless when you have to carry everything you own, and where social egalitarianism is enforced by the simple fact that anyone unhappy with a leader can just walk away and join another band. But semi-sedentary Natufians, invested in their heavy grinding stones and storage pits and familiar grain fields, couldn't just walk away as easily, and so social hierarchies began to emerge. Similar patterns were developing in other parts of the world, though independently and in different ways. In China, groups along the Yellow River were beginning to manage stands of wild millet. In Mesoamerica, people were tending wild teosinte, the ancestor of corn. In New Guinea, communities were manipulating wild yam patches and managing sago palms. In the eastern woodlands of North America, hunter-gatherers were cultivating squash and native grains. None of these people were farmers yet. They were still hunter-gatherers. They still got most of their calories from wild game and gathered plants. They still lived in relatively small, relatively mobile groups. But they were experimenting, testing the boundaries, figuring out that if you protect certain plants and harvest them carefully, they'll be there again next year. Noticing that seeds dropped near your camp might grow into productive stands. Learning that some landscapes could be shaped, managed, coaxed into greater productivity. They had no idea where this was leading. They couldn't have conceived of cities, couldn't have imagined agriculture, had no framework for understanding civilization. They were just doing what humans had always done, adapting to their circumstances, finding clever solutions to the challenges they faced. The increased food security from these early management strategies meant groups could stay in favoured locations longer. And staying longer meant investing more in those locations, building more substantial shelters, creating more permanent storage, defending territories more actively. Each of these steps made it harder to move, which created more incentive to intensify resource management, which supported larger populations, which increased competition for good territories, which created more pressure to stay and defend rather than move. It was a slow-motion feedback loop that would eventually, over thousands of years, transform human existence. But in 10,000 BCE, it was just beginning. Most humans still lived as their ancestors had for hundreds of thousands of years, mobile, egalitarian, intimately connected to the rhythms of the natural world. And by most measures they were doing well. Better than well, actually. The archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that late Paleolithic and early Neolithic hunter-gatherers, these people standing at the threshold of the agricultural revolution, might have been among the most content and satisfied humans who ever lived. Their diets were diverse and nutritious. Studies of their skeletal remains show they were generally healthy, often taller and more robust than the agricultural peoples who would succeed them. They suffered from fewer infectious diseases because their population densities were too low to sustain epidemic illnesses. Their teeth were healthier because they consumed less concentrated starch and sugar. They worked less than most agricultural peoples. Time use studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest 15 to 20 hours per week securing food, with the rest spent in leisure, socializing, ritual activities, and rest. That's far less than agricultural peoples, who must work constantly during planting and harvest seasons, or modern industrial workers putting in 40 to 60-hour weeks. Their social bonds were strong. Living in small groups where everyone knew everyone, cooperation was constant and conflict was rare. They had sophisticated mechanisms for dispute resolution, sharing resources and maintaining social harmony. Their egalitarian ethos meant everyone had voice and status. Nobody was truly powerless. Nobody was truly dominant. They found deep meaning in their lives. Their animistic beliefs connected them to a world alive with spiritual significance. Every hunt was a negotiation with animal spirits. Every plant harvest required proper respect and gratitude. Every natural phenomenon spoke of the sacred powers that animated all things. They lived embedded in stories, myths, and rituals that gave shape and purpose to existence. Most strikingly, they had something that many modern humans lack entirely. They lived with almost complete autonomy. They made their own decisions about where to go, what to do, who to associate with. No bosses, no rulers, no one who could compel their obedience. If they disliked how things were going in one band, they could walk away and join another. If they disagreed with a decision, they could argue against it, and their voice carried weight. This isn't to romanticize their lives. Infant mortality was high. Injuries could be catastrophic without modern medicine. Periodic famines were real threats. Violence, though rare, could be sudden and deadly. Life expectancy was short by modern standards, though not as short as many people assume. Those who survived childhood often lived into their 60s or beyond. But by their own standards, by the measures that mattered to them, they were successful. They were living as humans had evolved to live, in tight-knit groups, connected to nature, with agency over their lives and meaningful relationships with their communities. They had no idea that in a few thousand years their descendants would live in cities of millions, that most humans would spend their lives as farmers, labourers, servants, slaves, grinding out existence under the control of rulers and elites, that infectious diseases would become humanity's greatest killer, that social inequality would become so extreme that some individuals controlled the labour of thousands, that most humans would live and die without ever knowing the autonomy and freedom they took for granted. The agricultural revolution would bring abundance, but it would come at a cost that no one could have anticipated. Farming could support far larger populations than hunting and gathering, but it required harder work, produced less nutritious diets, and created the conditions for epidemic disease. Permanent settlements enabled the accumulation of knowledge and technology, but they also enabled the accumulation of power and wealth, creating hierarchies that would eventually stratify humanity into rulers and ruled. Cities would become centres of art, learning, and innovation, but they would also become centres of poverty, disease, and oppression. Civilization would produce writing, mathematics, architecture, philosophy, but it would also produce slavery, warfare, and the systematic exploitation of the many by the few. None of this was inevitable. Nothing in human nature required agriculture or cities or civilization. These developments emerge from specific circumstances, chance environmental changes, and the accumulated consequences of thousands of small decisions by people who couldn't see where those decisions were leading. The people of 10,000 BCE, standing at the edge of transformation, had no prophecy of what was coming. They were just trying to feed their families, support their communities, and live meaningful lives. Some groups were experimenting with new subsistence strategies. Others were continuing age-old patterns that had sustained humanity for hundreds of millennia. Neither could know that they were living through one of the great turning points in human history, that within a few thousand years almost everything about human existence would change, that the mobile, egalitarian, spiritually rich lifestyle they knew would become increasingly rare, eventually surviving only in the most marginal environments that agriculture couldn't penetrate. They lived in the last age of human freedom, the last time when most humans answered to no one but themselves and their communities. The last era when humanity lived lightly on the earth, taking what they needed and moving on, leaving behind barely a trace. The seeds of agriculture were already germinating. The first settlements were already being established. The long path towards civilization had already begun, but they didn't know it. And in their unknowing, they were perhaps more fortunate than any humans who would come after. So here we are, 12,000 years removed from the world of 10,000 BCE, a world without cities, without agriculture, without written language or permanent architecture, a world that might seem impossibly distant, almost alien compared to our modern lives of smartphones and supermarkets and climate-controlled environments. But here's what you need to understand. Those people weren't primitive. They weren't stumbling through existence, barely surviving by luck and instinct. They were us. Fully modern humans with brains identical to ours, equipped with thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, perfectly adapted to their world in ways we can barely comprehend. A hunter-gatherer at 10,000 BCE could identify hundreds of plant species by sight, sound, and smell. They could track animals across landscapes we'd consider featureless. They could predict weather patterns, find water in seemingly barren terrain, create fire in driving rain. They knew the medicinal properties of dozens of plants, the behavior patterns of every animal in their territory, the seasonal movements of resources across hundreds of square miles. Try dropping the average modern human into that world, without tools, without maps, without the accumulated knowledge of a band who'd lived there for generations. Most of us would be dead within a week. So when we look back at 10,000 BCE, we're not looking at humanity's childhood. We're looking at a different kind of adulthood, one adapted to different challenges, different opportunities, different ways of being human. But we've lost things. Make no mistake about that. We've lost the deep ecological knowledge that made every landscape readable, every season predictable. Most modern humans can't name the trees in their neighbourhood, much less use them for food, medicine, or materials. We've lost the intense social bonds that came from depending on the same 30 people for your entire life. Modern humans might have hundreds of social media connections, but how many could you call at 3 a.m? How many would share their last food with you without question? We've lost time abundance. Hunter-gatherers worked maybe 20 to 30 hours a week to meet all their survival needs. The rest was leisure. Time for stories, for art, for playing with children, for lying under stars and contemplating existence. We've traded that for 40-hour work weeks, commutes, emails that follow us home. We've lost the radical egalitarianism that came from mobile life. When you can't accumulate possessions, when leadership has to be earned fresh every day through demonstrated skill and generosity, when anyone dissatisfied with a group can just walk away and join another band, inequality stays minimal. Everyone mattered, everyone contributed, everyone's voice counted. But we've gained things too. Enormous things. Security from starvation. Yes, modern inequality means many still go hungry, but the baseline possibility of food storage, of agricultural surplus, has liberated billions from the knife edge of seasonal want. Medical care that lets children survive infancy at rates our ancestors couldn't imagine. That lets mothers survive childbirth. That makes old age possible for more than just the exceptionally lucky or hardy. Technology that's expanded human possibility beyond anything achievable in small mobile bands. Art that can reach millions. Ideas that can spread globally. Human cooperation at scales that would have been literally unthinkable at 10,000 BCE. Liberation from constant, immediate survival needs. Time and energy to become specialists. To dive deep into mathematics or music or medicine. To build on what previous generations learned rather than starting fresh each generation. But here's the thing, and this is crucial. Our bodies haven't caught up. Our minds haven't caught up. We're still running Paleolithic hardware trying to handle post-industrial software. Our stress responses are calibrated for brief, acute dangers like predators and raids, not chronic worries about mortgages and email. Our dietary preferences were shaped by environments where calories were scarce and unpredictable, not by supermarkets offering unlimited processed foods. Our social needs were designed for tight-knit bands of familiar faces, not anonymous cities of millions. This is why so many modern humans feel vaguely, persistently out of place, anxious without immediate threat, lonely in crowds, craving movement but trapped at desks, seeking meaning in consumption but finding only temporary satisfaction. We're fish trying to live on land. It can be done, we're doing it. But we still dream of water. Understanding this, understanding where we came from and how recently we left that world behind, doesn't mean we should or could go back. The population that numbered maybe 5 million globally at 10,000 BCE now exceeds 8 billion. Hunter-gatherer life can't scale to support that. The door behind us is closed. But understanding our past helps us imagine different futures, ways of organizing society that honor our deep need for community, for meaningful work, for connection with living systems, ways of using our incredible technology not to further disconnect us from each other and the natural world, but to support more humane, more sustainable, more satisfying ways of being human. The people of 10,000 BCE faced their world with courage, ingenuity, and profound cooperation. They survived ice ages and climate chaos. They created the first art, the first music, the first spiritual systems. They made us possible. The least we can do is remember them. And maybe, just maybe, learn from them. If this journey through deep history resonated with you, help this channel continue exploring humanity's story. Hit that like button, subscribe for more history content designed for deep listening, and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Cozy in bed? On a long drive? Drop a comment below with your location. Let's build a community of history lovers scattered across the modern world, connected by curiosity about the ancient one. Sweet dreams wherever you are, and remember, you're carrying 300,000 years of survival, adaptation, and triumph in every cell of your body. That's not nothing. That's everything.